Um, Thanks, Kevin, for those really kind words. I have to admit to being quite humble about being nominated for the award and receiving it, but also very excited. What I'd like to do first is acknowledge the traditional owners of our country that I present to you from and pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge the deep feeling of attachment and relationship of the Aboriginal people to country, and I respect and value their past, present and ongoing connections to the land and cultural beliefs which centre around a large area of the Adelaide Plains, including where the city of Adelaide is. So the title I've got for this talk is what I've learned from a career studying dark taxa. And what I sort of decided to do was, rather than take you for a sort of a summary romp through the research that I've done over the last 3 decades, really tell you a few things about how I got to be where I am today and the early stages of my career. And then I want to say something towards the end about Taxonomy Australia, and also some things that we need to think about seriously as we go forward trying to describe the biodiversity of the country. So first of all, I grew up in an incredibly beautiful part of Sydney, down in the Sutherland Shire, and the family home overlooked Yowie Bay, which was only a couple of kilometres from Cronulla Beach, where I spent most of my summers, and it's also quite close to Kurnell, which was Captain Cook's landing site, where Joseph Banks collected the sort of first insects that were described back in Europe. So that's a location that 15 years later I was looking at the holotypes that came from the Banks material, which played a part into some of the early research that I did. I had incredibly supportive and very, very talented parents. My father didn't finish high school. He tried to enlist in the army in the Second World War when he was 15, and my grandfather had to go and get him from the recruitment office. They'd already signed him up until they found that he was 2.5 years too young. But you could get into the Navy at 16, and so the following year he enlisted in the Navy and served as a medical assistant on a destroyer and a frigate out of Darwin, and saw quite a lot of action, which I only came to really find out about, I think, much later in my life. My father used to get these boils on his back sort of infrequently, a couple of times a year. What I didn't know was it was actually microscopic pieces of shrapnel that was working their way to the surface. After the war, he did some non-degree training as an industrial chemist, and became interested in the application of the new generation of plastics that had been developed, and particularly in regard to their medical application. And one of the things that the family is really proud of is a number of applications that ended up being patented by the company he worked for. But he was instrumental in designing the resin plastics that surrounded the very first heart pacemakers, which were about 5 times bigger than pacemakers are today. But at the time, in the sort of mid-late 60s, this was absolutely revolutionary. My mother, Betty Austin, was equally talented, but in very different ways. She finished high school and went off to Secretarial College, but she won a scholarship to the Sydney Conservatorium to train as a opera singer, and in the late 40s she placed second in the Sydney Eisteddfod to a little-known Joan Sutherland at the time, who obviously went on to be one of Australia's sort of really great opera singers. My brother and sister, shown on the right there, inherited some of her musical abilities, and both of them have fantastic singing voices and play instruments. This is a set of genes that I completely failed to get in my ancestry, and if any of you have ever heard me sing, you'll know that's exactly right. But through the whole of my career, my parents gave me, huge support and really supported me in every endeavour that I wanted to pursue. I went to Endeavour High School in Caringbah, which was a public school, had a fantastic science department and a really talented group of science teachers. The term endeavour, I don't think related necessarily to the approach of the students at the school. It relates directly, though, to the name of the boat, because the school is one of the closest high schools to the Captain Cook landing site at Kurnell. One of the teachers, Sue Josephson at my high school, was instrumental in, I think, motivating me to go on in biology, and she really was one of those special teachers that were easy to relate to, and I'm in fact still in contact with her occasionally, and she's now in her late 70s, retired in Sydney. From when I was in year 12, one of my first heroes, I think, was Gough Whitlam. He managed to do two things that had a direct impact on my life. In 1972, I was in year 12, and when the Whitlam government got in, he did two things that, apart from many others. One of them was the termination of military conscription, which came into effect about 3 months before my birthday date would have been thrown into the draw, the lottery for conscription to go to Vietnam. So I was kind of pleased that that stopped. The other thing that he did was instrumental in introducing university education for free, and he abolished university fees. Back in the early 70s, university fees in today's dollars were probably about twice of what the current HECS fees were. It was very, very expensive to go to university, and many young people from low-income families just never went to university then. It was much more linked to the socio-economic conditions of society at the time. I then went on to Sydney University and did a double major in zoology, and I first met Murray Fletcher, who was a PhD student when I was doing honours, and back then doing honours was kind of pretty special. I had a third year class of 120, and only 7 of us went on to do honours. It was, a wonderful time, and Sydney University was a fantastic place then and now, and with many fond memories. And that group of honours students went on, all of them, to do postgraduate work, and they went into state research departments, CSIRO. One of them headed up the Antarctic division for 10 or 12 years. The year following honours, I had a tutorship in zoology for a year, and it was a time that allowed me to work out what I wanted to do as a postgraduate student, which ended up going to Adelaide University to the entomology department on the Wake campus, and I did a project on the ecology of clubionid spiders and their egg parasitoids. And it was at this time that I really became interested in the systematics and evolution of parasitoids, and it really set the direction for pretty much most of what I've done sort of, you know, post PhD. 6 months after I finished my PhD, I managed to land a job at the Natural History Museum in London. And the 3 years that I was there, I probably learned more about parasitoids than I have in the whole of the rest of my career. There was a specialist on pretty much every group of insects in the entomology department. At that time, Lawrence Mound, who many of you will know, was the head of entomology. There were people like Ian Gould, pictured at the top right there, who worked on echimonids. Staniak Bocek had his book on Australian chalcidoids, published while I was there, and there were colleagues like Nick Day working on pillards and John Noyes working on chalcidoids. It was really a remarkable time as a young scientist to be there. And it wasn't just the staff who worked there, but while the 3 years I was there, pretty much every expert in the world came to the BM because you had to look at the collections. So a truly fantastic time. The person that I interacted with the most and who taught me a huge amount was Tom Huddleston, the braconid taxonomist. Tom was a sort of reserved Englishman who sort of worked tirelessly on braconid wasps globally and had this encyclopedic knowledge of the characters that were important for their discrimination. He also had an incredibly wicked sense of humor, and he used to do caricatures of people. And he did a series of sort of drawings of me where I just got skinnier and skinnier and skinnier. And in Tom's caricatures, no one had clothes on. So this was one of the drawings that he did of me. I actually got skinnier in later drawings than this, but this was his impression of Andy Austin, who'd arrived at the Natural History Museum the year before. And if you can't read the box at my feet, it says latex macho suit, and the follow-up drawing the following day was this one, which at the time wasn't so funny because Tom managed to, I only saw this a week later, and in that week just about everyone at the Natural History Museum had seen the drawings that he'd done. So not because of this, but not too long afterwards, I escaped London and I came back. I'd been interviewed for the lectureship in systematic entomology at Adelaide University, and so I came back in 1985 to take up the position I currently have now. And I spent the first sort of few years, 15 years, on the Waite campus of the university, and then moved into the North Terrace campus, really to take advantage of the reorganisation that had happened in the university. But also, it was at that time that Bob Hill, who'd arrived as a paleobotanist, and Steve Donnellan at the South Australian Museum, we formed what became the Centre for Evolutionary Biology and Biodiversity at Adelaide University. And this was the conduit that really put the collaborations between the university, the museum, and the herbarium into a formal setting. And one of the outcomes of this was developing a really state-of-the-art suite of laboratories for molecular evolution and systematics. And that has run for nearly the last 20 years as and really an example of best practice, I think, in institutional collaboration. Just after arriving back in Adelaide, I was only there for 3 weeks before I'd secured a position on the Royal Entomological Society's Project WALLACE, which was a year-long insect expedition to northern Sulawesi, and it was a truly remarkable field trip. In fact, field trip's not really the right word. There's probably not been a field trip anywhere in the world that sort of parallels the organisation and the length and the logistics that was involved in it. The project had British military logistics support, and so there were army surveyors and doctors and mechanics and cooks and all types of expertise, and they kept us healthy and fed and stopped us from getting lost in the rainforest, which helped optimize the amount of time that you had for collecting and doing research. And the material that was collected on that trip, most of it went back to the Natural History Museum, but there were people from around the world on the trip, and it played into a huge number of research projects, including some of my own. So over the last 30 years, my research really falls into three major areas: the systematics and evolution of parasitic Hymenoptera, systematics and biology of Australian spiders, which has very much been in collaboration with Mark Harvey, and more recently, the systematics and phylogeography of subterranean invertebrates, and that's very much with the group in Adelaide. One of the things that has been, I think, most satisfying and really very exciting is the wonderful and very, very talented group of people that I've been able to work with. And they have a lot to do, a huge amount to do, in fact, with the research success I've had. And this is the group in Adelaide, sort of currently and recently, a truly wonderful and very, very talented group of researchers and students. And what I should take the opportunity of doing is these people, Alana, Erin, Perry and Michelle, among others, have been instrumental in making this a truly wonderful, well-organised conference. And I know from the front end, it's looked seamlessly, but being in the room next door, I've been able to see the amount of work and effort and trials and tribulations that they've gone through to make the conference success. And so you guys have done a truly wonderful job, and you should be congratulated. In addition to the Adelaide group, I've had a wonderful set of collaborators around Australia and internationally, and these are some of them, which I won't go through them all, and it's only a proportion of them, but I will point out two people who I have worked probably most closely with over the last couple of decades, and one is Mark Harvey, who most of you know, and the other one is the late John LaSalle, who I was starting to collaborate with really extensively when he was taken from us much prematurely than should have happened. So the title of this talk was about dark taxa, and this is a term I've never particularly liked, but it's kind of embedded now in the literature. And it refers to hyperdiverse groups of invertebrates, but also other groups of organisms, in particular fungi, that comprise astronomical numbers of new species, often revealed in the last 20 years through DNA barcoding type initiatives. And this really relates, I think, to how we need to think about how we do the business of taxonomy in Australia into the future, and what's required to meet the challenges that we are facing now and will do so more into the future. There are, one of the ultimate dark taxa are parasitic Hymenoptera, and these are wasps that either parasitize their hosts externally, or they lay their eggs internally, in the case of endoparasitoids, in their host, and then feed internally on the host and kill it. And it's this plus their host specificity that makes them incredibly important biological control agents. Recently, this paper, which a group tried to quantify, I think quite successfully, the diversity of parasitic Hymenoptera in particular, and they posit that the group is actually more speciose than Coleoptera, and that's not the important thing in this paper. The important thing is the just how poorly studied and what the attributes are of the group that is making them obviously so highly speciated, and it's these 5 characters. The fact that huge numbers of them, the vast majority of parasitoid diversity is in the size range less than 2 millimeters, and associated with this, there's extreme homoplasy, and it's associated with size-related morphological reduction of characters. As they get smaller, they just don't have characters that you can use for species discrimination. Associated with that, there's rampant cryptic speciation, and the fact that they have radiated into virtually all groups of insects and spiders, and they show extreme host specificity, in particular endoparasitoids, which are challenged by the host's immune system, and it's the adaptations they have to overcome that immune system that often leads to host specificity. And just some examples, these are wasps from 4 different families, and even though they have synapomorphies to identify families relatively easily, when you get down to the species level, they just do not have characters in many cases to separate species. And all of these images are for wasps that are smaller than 1 millimeter in length. And my married, second from the left, is about 0.5 millimeter in length. Parasitism evolved once in the Hymenoptera and then radiated into all of the available host groups. And not only do they parasitize all insect groups, but there are clades that specialize in parasitizing eggs, some specialize in parasitizing larvae or pupae, and rarely adults. And so this is the basis of, I think, the massive species diversity that we see in the group. One group, the microgastrines, which specialize in parasitizing caterpillars. This elegant study done in Costa Rica using material reared from Dan Jansen's moth and butterfly larval rearing program in Costa Conservation Park showed they recorded 171 morphospecies, but DNA barcoding added an additional 42 cryptic species, and virtually all of these, the total of over 300, were all virtually host-specific to a single host. One of the disturbing things about this project also is after 30 years of rearing, the accumulation of species for just 2 superfamilies, chalcidoids and ecumenoids, is nowhere near reaching an asymptote. They do not know yet how many parasitoids they've got in this relatively small conservation park. So, Taxonomy Australia. We have set ourselves a mission to discover and document all of the remaining Australian species of plants, animals, fungi in a generation. And 2 questions posed from this. One, is it achievable? And to my mind, it doesn't actually matter whether it's achievable in a generation or not. It is setting an agenda, which I think we can effectively use to raise funds to support a much more targeted and clear strategic approach for describing the biota of the continent. This is information on the number of species that are described annually for Australia and globally, and I'm indebted to Matthew Locker, Anna Munro and Tom May for helping me put together these data. So on average, Australian taxonomists describe about 900 species a year, and for globally, it's just over 17,000. Insects make up about 42% of it, and arthropods about 65%, but you can see the relative sizes of the number of species that are described on an annual basis. if you just bear with me for a sec there. If you look at the estimated species for the Australian biota, which this is data from Chapman's 2009 biodiversity report, it's estimated there are about 320,000 species in Australia. And these are the proportions for those. Arthropods make up about 74%, and the groups that sort of increase, and it points to the groups that are relatively poorly studied compared to others, are sort of significantly larger than the number of species that are described on an annual basis. And there's really, I think, at least 4 elephants in the room. Talked about parasitic Hymenoptera. Mites are one group where it's estimated there are about 30,000 species for the country. For nematodes, it's estimated there are about 50,000 species, and there is about 2,000 described, and fungi are about 50,000 species as well. The less well-known groups, we know about the number of species, the less accurate are the estimates for the estimated number of species, if you like. And one of the issues here is, I think, for these groups, we really do not have any firm or accurate idea about the true diversity of these groups, and there is the potential for them to be much more speciose than the sort of hand-waving exercise estimates that have happened in recent years. There have been a number of approaches for how people can rapidly describe species, and this one from Mike Sharkey, which has received very significant sort of criticism in the literature from people like Rudolf Myers and others. They've advocated simply the description of species on consensus barcodes with an image and a holotype. The images are of poor quality and not diagnostic. And I think Sharkey's kind of on the right track here, but it was just, to my mind, a shoddy piece of work that was thrown together too quickly. If not the Sharkey approach, then how do we effectively deal with describing hyperdiverse groups? And I think using sequence data should almost be mandatory, but it needs to be more than just CO1. I think it needs to be based on multiple genes. We use morphology where possible, but limited to simply sort of diagnostic characters only, associated with high quality images. But we need to prioritize groups as well, according on who the user groups are and whether that information is going to be picked up and used, as opposed to groups that at this point in time, there is no defined user group for. When it comes down to it though, the real urgent need is for a national training program. There just are not enough young researchers on the ground to be able to tackle the hyperdiverse groups in Australia, and that relates to funding and also prioritising funding. And I think at the moment, I think what's happened with the development of Taxonomy Australia is that for the first time, I have some confidence that we have a mechanism now to lobby and advocate for increased funding, which can be brought to bear on this great challenge. Just to finish up, when I'm not doing research, this is where I live in the Adelaide Hills. My family and I run a small farm, which has had 2 great enterprises. One breeding Labrador puppies, which highly intelligent Labrador puppies, as you can see, which have gone into guide dog and assistance dog programs and as family pets. And we also breed and train Shetland ponies. And just to finish up, I would like to offer my very special thanks to Sally and Tess for putting up with me over the last 30+ years in my research endeavours and the eccentricities that I show when I'm trying to talk to them about parasitic wasps. And that photo on the right is my pandemic office. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Andy. That was just fantastic. So we do have some time for questions. We've got about 7 minutes. If you do have one, feel free to put it in the chat or just speak aloud by unmuting your microphone.
Andy, I have a question, if I may, or Perry, may I?
Sure.
You mentioned, you made the very good point that even estimating the numbers of these hyperdiverse and poorly known groups is very hard to do and is very challenging. One way that we could improve our estimates of the numbers is by describing them all, but clearly that that's going to take a while. Have you put any thought to ways in which we can improve our estimation of total numbers without having to describe them all? Because it'd be worthwhile to do if there was a good way to do it.
Yeah, look, I think the only way you can do it is really to bring to bear the sort of new generation of sequencing technologies that's coming on board, which, there's a whole range of technologies that, that I know a lot of people sort of are familiar with, but it provides an opportunity to get a rapid estimate of number of species at point localities, and also to be able to compare those data to other localities. But when it comes down to it, part of the issue is actually the sampling regimes that you use. And the Costa Rican project is a really good example where a point locality has had one of the most intensive sampling programs over 30 years, and the number of species in a hyperdiverse groups is still escalating. And so to my mind, look, we know these groups are hyperdiverse, and we may have the estimates, I think they're all underestimates. I don't think any of them are overestimates. And in some respects, intellectually, I don't know how important it is to have very accurate estimates, but we can move in a direction where we get better and better estimates, I think, as time goes by, and we, are adopting approaches to be able to do that. If the estimates end up being just horribly wrong and too conservative, it will do us a disservice in trying to sell the project as doable within a generation, if you know what I mean. And so I think there's a lot less than 30% of the biota is described when you take the hyperdiverse groups. But I think as a selling point, 30% is about right, because it makes the task look like it's doable. And if it's not doable, we're still going to make a huge amount of headway and know an awful lot more about the continent's biota.
Andy, it's Mark here. I've got two quick questions. One is, you talk about parasitic Hymenoptera radiating into every group of insects, just about, plus spiders. Are you aware of any radiations that have gone into mites, or are mites simply too small for parasitic Hymenoptera to tackle?
Look, whether they're too, there are some mites that are not small, though. They're as big as many of the insect hosts that they parasitize. So there might be one or two non-Australian examples of parasitoids that hit orobatid mites, but they are very, very rare. And so, it might be more common than we think, but it's not hugely common, I don't think. I don't think there's a huge pool of hosts there that have been exploited by parasitoids that we just haven't twigged onto. I think there's something about mites that lend themselves to not being suitable hosts.
Perry, can I ask a second question? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. We've still got some time.
Great. Do you think there's scope to undertake this mission, the Taxonomy Australia mission? How do you think the ABRS research program can be rejigged, apart from the obvious, which is just a massive increase in funding? Do you have any ideas about that? Because that's probably going to be the one area where we can get some traction with government.
What's happening at the moment is that the staff within the department, there is an exercise going on inside the department to try and put a case for an increased budget for ABRS, and Taxonomy Australia is doing that externally through the Australian Academy of Science and directly to the Minister for Environment. But I think the ABRS budget is now languishing at such a low level that it needs an increase in its budget of an order of magnitude to actually be truly effective. Now, it's not going to get that straight away, but what needs to go hand in hand with that is, I think, a much more strategic approach to how the budget is utilised. And I think one of those things which is, I think, going to be most important is the development of a training program for both PhD students and postdocs. And importantly, to keep, we spend a huge amount of time and effort training postdocs, and then if there's nothing for them to go on to. So I think an ongoing postdoc program is going to be critical. But I think there needs to be a rethink about how resources are brought to bear on the biota most effectively. And I don't think it can be necessarily proportioned up based on the estimates of numbers of undescribed taxa, but I think it needs to take that into account to a greater degree than it is. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So we've got one question in the chat. I think we have just enough time for that one from Laura. I can read that one out to you if you want, Andy. Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Andy. Great talk. How do you envision we will prioritize groups according to user groups in order to deal with describing hyperdiverse groups?
Yeah. When I'm saying prioritizing groups is just one aspect of how you would choose to fund research on particular groups. Now, to my mind, there aren't very many groups of, for example, terrestrial arthropods that you can't make a good case to work on. They're either important in biological control, they're important in conservation, they're important in biodiversity assessment, they're used in environmental monitoring by companies. So I think it's just something that I see people working on groups without trying to make a case or work out what their user group even is. And I think it's important for us to actually do that. Apart from anything, those user groups can actually, once identified, can then be targeted for advocacy to get them involved in making funding contributions to various projects.
Great. Okay, I think we'll move on, but could you all please join me in thanking Andy again for an absolutely fantastic talk?
Thanks very much, Ferry.